In front of me, I have two great looking steaks. They've got these beautiful crusts. You can't smell them, but I can, and they smell great. We all know you can't judge a steak by its crust, so let's have a peek inside. So both of these strip steaks looked great on the outside, but cut them open, and what you see is this one doesn't look so great. It's got that ring of gray meat that's overcooked, dry. It's just not what you want. This one, however, looks fantastic. It's nice and rosy from edge to edge. You're thinking, this is Cooks Illustrated. You reverse seared it, right? We love our reverse sear, but I didn't use that this time around. I didn't bother with a sous-vide circulator either. I used a method that was faster and it was easier. This steak was cold seared. Before we get into cooking steaks, let's talk about our goals here. What we want is a really great sear on the outside, great browning, a good crust. That's where a lot of the flavor is. We also want the center to be cooked from edge to edge. I shoot for 125 because I like my steaks at medium rare. If you like your steaks cooked a little more, take them a little higher. There's also the bonus points. I want a method that is quick. I want a method that doesn't make a mess, and I don't want to use any special equipment. So I came up working in restaurants and I learned how to cook a steak with a very traditional method. My chefs would have me put a skillet on the stove, put a good amount of oil in there, crank the heat, and wait for it to start smoking. So when the pan is hot enough, screaming hot, lots of smoke, the steak goes in, and the thing they all tell you is, do not touch that steak. You get to flip it once, just once. Let's be honest, everyone peeks to make sure it's time to flip. What's happening, it's developing a really great crust. You're getting a lot of Maillard browning. Once you get great browning on the first side, you flip it over. Again, you wait and wait and wait some more. By then, the steak is mostly cooked. It's pretty close. You slip it in the oven, let it finish there. And you're just waiting for the center to hit 125 or 130, whatever your serving temp is. It's fast. You don't need special equipment. The crust it puts on a steak is fantastic. They look gorgeous. So the cons for this method. It's kind of messy. It's kind of actually really messy, and you're going to trash your skillet, and it's going to take a lot of scrubbing to clean it up again. And you might want to have a lot of windows open, fan on, pull the batteries out of your smoke detector. It's not great. But even worse, if you cut into the steak, what you're going to see is a big ring of gray around a rosy center. As you're cooking the meat, you're pumping a ton of heat into the surface, and that heat will slowly work its way towards the center, cooking the steak, which is what we want. But because it takes so long to do that, you end up overcooking the edges, and that's why you get that gray band. Even professionals have a hard time with this method. So enter sous vide. Now, short digression. I was a chemistry major before I started cooking, and it was really weird to be in the restaurant and see lab equipment floating around. There were these immersion circulators, which are these machines that can hold water at very specific temperatures, and they were being used in the kitchen. What they were being used for was sous vide cooking. Now, sous vide means under vacuum. And what's happening is you're taking your steak, sticking it in a bag, sucking all the air out, and then you drop that bag into your water bath. And then you wait some more, maybe a couple more hours, depends on what you're cooking. But over time, the water is gently cooking the meat so that it is at the perfect temperature inside. After it gets there, you take it out of the bath, out of the bag, pop it in a pan, and give it a quick sear on each side. You build up a great crust in almost no time, so you're not making much of a mess. It's pretty great. But, there are some drawbacks as well. You have to invest in a sous vide circulator, and they can be pricey. You're going through a bunch of plastic bags to cook your meat. It takes up some space on your counter, and it's going to take up that space for anywhere between 1.5 to 3 hours. You compare that to a traditional method that takes 10 minutes. It's a big time investment. Sous vide cooking is great, but it wasn't always accessible to everyone. Restaurant chefs could afford to spend thousands of dollars on chemistry lab equipment, but you weren't doing that at home. Back in 2007, Kenji Lopez-Alt developed a recipe for Cooks Illustrated based on this hack of sous vide cooking, and he dubbed it the reverse sear. Here's how it works. Take the steaks, pop them on a cooling rack, put that rack on a rimmed baking sheet, and stick the whole setup in a 275-degree oven. You wait for 20-25 minutes, and what you're looking for is the center of that steak to hit 90 to 95 degrees. After that, you take them out, put them in a skillet, and give them a hard sear. And that sear doesn't just build the crust, it's taking the steaks up to your serving temperature. So you need to make sure you're temping the steaks both while they're in the oven and then again when you're searing to make sure that they don't overcook. So the reverse sear method will get you what you can get with sous vide, and it'll do it faster. You won't need to have special fancy equipment for it, which we love. But on the downside, you do have to use a couple extra pieces of equipment, and you do need to heat your oven. So with a reverse sear, we're getting closer to what we want. How do we shave off even more time? Enter cold searing. The only piece of cooking equipment we need for cold searing is this nonstick skillet. I've got a strip steak here, and you can use any steak you want. Boneless steaks are ideal. The key is to make sure your steak is 1.5 inches thick. I'm gonna pat this steak dry. I wanna get rid of all the moisture on the surface. Next up, I'm going to pepper the steak. Looking for maybe about a half teaspoon of pepper or so. You can kind of do this to taste. What I'm not doing is salting this. I'll salt this later with one of my favorite salts. If you want and you have the time and you remember, you can salt this guy 45 minutes in advance or up to a day in advance, but you don't have to. The important bit is that you don't want to salt right before cooking. Salting draws out moisture, and that will impact the sear. So next up we sear. I've got my cold pan, no oil, it's perfect. All right, let's get cooking for real. I've got the heat set to high, and I'm not worried about the fact that I'm in a nonstick skillet at all. The meat is gonna suck some of that heat up, and I'm gonna turn it down pretty soon. We need to heat up that skillet, and I wanna start driving off some of the water that's on the surface of the steak so that we can get good browning. So what I'm hearing is actually really good. Some of the juices are starting to come out. The fat is rendering out of here as well. And that sizzling is the water starting to get driven off by the heat. We're gonna cook this steak in its own fat. There's plenty of fat in here. It's more than enough. It also limits the amount of fat that can splatter out of the pan and keeps this really neat. Now it's just a matter of waiting for this side to fully heat up for more of that fat to render out. It's been 2 minutes. Let's give it a flip and see what's happened. Great. Okay, don't worry. There's no browning, and that's the way it's supposed to be. We're not trying to get all of that color on the first go because it's actually easier to build up layers of color as we cook. So I'm just going to let this pan keep going at high heat for another 2 minutes on this side. We're going to do the same thing to the second side of the steak. So this first 4 minutes of blasting the heat and just letting the steak kind of go gray, think of it as setting yourself up for success. You're getting fat out of that steak. It's going to be really flavorful, and you're searing your meat. You're also pulling those juices out. Those juices have the proteins and amino acids you need to build a beautiful crust. As those juices cook down and reduce in this pan, they can't stick to the pan, so they're going to stick to the steak, and that's what helps us build a beautiful, beautiful surface. 2 minutes has passed. Give this another flip. Now what I want to do is reduce the heat. What I'm looking for here is a nice medium, and I'm not just looking for it, I'm listening for it as well. What I want to hear is this gentle sizzle. I don't want like a really loud, aggressive sizzle. I also don't want to see any splatter. I don't want to see any smoke coming up because that means we're going a little too hard and a little too fast. The meat that's just below the surface is picking up a ton of heat from that skillet. We want to let some of that heat move towards the center so that the steak is cooking, but we want the rest of that heat to get out of there because if it hangs out there, it's going to overcook the meat, and that's when the gray band develops. Every 2 minutes, what I'm going to do is flip it. Look at that. We're starting to get some color. This is great. Still not a ton of drama. We're slowly building up our layers of crust, and the heat that got built up just below this surface while this side was touching the pan, some of it is dissipating into the air. The rest of it is moving towards the center of the meat. None of it is staying just below the surface and turning the meat gray, and that's exactly what we want. Nice. I am 4 minutes into cooking at medium heat, and sometimes, depending on what you think medium heat is and how thick your steak is, could be done. This does not feel done to me. If you've got an especially large steak, it could take up to another 6 minutes, 10 minutes total cooking at medium heat. So keep an eye on it, check it with your thermometer as you go, and it'll take as long as it takes. One of the things I like about this method is I'm kind of fidgety. I don't like looking at my food and not touching it, and it's totally fine to move this one around. If there are little patches of fond, you can kind of mop them up with the steak so they stick to the meat instead of the pan. Yes. I love watching that crust kind of develop with every flip. There's something so satisfying about it. If I were searing a regular steak, my hands could not be right here. It would be way too hot and way too splattery. This method is so neat. It makes cleanup a snap. I'm about 7 minutes in. It is feeling firm, which is a good sign that you should kind of start picking up the thermometer and checking. I don't like to go straight down. It's really hard to figure out where the center is. Instead, I come in from the side. And to make sure I don't overshoot the center, I'll kind of like mark off where the middle is and then just stick the thermometer in till my thumb hits the meat. We are at 125. Let's get this out of the pan and onto a board. Like all seared steaks, this needs a 5-minute rest. If you slice into them right away, the juices are really active and they're flowing and they're gonna flow right out of there. By resting it, they kind of slow down, the steak cools a little bit. So all those juices, they're in the bite instead of on your board. So this steak has rested for 5 minutes. Time to slice it open. Look at that cook. I like to use a coarse salt for this because it adds some crunch. It's not gonna dissolve right away and that bit of texture is awesome. This is so good. It's juicy, it's tender, it's got great flavor. Pops of salt are wonderful. This is all I want in a steak. You can see why this is my favorite method. It's quick, just as quick as the traditional method. You get that great sear and that edge-to-edge cook and you nail the temperature, which is what sous vide and the reverse sear do for us. But no special equipment, no mess. We've modified this method to produce recipes for pork chops that are perfectly browned and nicely cooked, super juicy. You can even use it to make really great salmon fillets with crispy skin. It's a great method. It is my go-to. Now just one more bite. I kind of like my steaks sliced super thin. They're just extra tender that way. So how do you cook your steaks? Are you a traditionalist? Have I convinced you to give up sous vide for a cold sear? Let me know in the comments below, drop a like, and be sure to head over to cooksillustrated.com to check out some other techniques.